Good afternoon and welcome to the second in our series of Young Reporters sessions with our mentors. I'm really glad to see you all here today. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy day to come and learn with us today. Today, I'm really pleased to say we will be talking about effective storytelling. And as you know, writing is one of the ways that you can enter the Young Reporters for the Environment competition. But all of the methods, including photography and video and writing, are all storytelling in their own special ways. So today I am thrilled to say that we have Ross Brannigan here to join us. Ooh, like that. Ross is an award-winning writer, journalist, public speaker, and author of Running Adventures Scotland, his latest book. He reports on ultra-distance cycling races and has written for magazines such as Trail Running, Scots Magazine, and The Fell Runner. He frequently writes about his adventures in wild places and the environment over on his blog. So there's his book and his blog, rossrunswild.com, and his recent book, Running Adventures Scotland. And he currently works as a membership officer for the conservation charity, the John Muir Trust. Welcome, Ross. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Hello.
Really looking forward to hearing what you have to say. I'm going to mute now and let you take over.
That's great. Thanks a lot, Kat. And really lovely to have everyone here, and also to those who are watching the recording. Great to have you watching this as well. So yeah, as Kat mentioned, I'm Ross Brannigan. I'm going to be talking to you today about environmental storytelling, and touching a lot on like writing for nature, people, and the environment. And we'll go on a few different places as I go along through my presentation today. Some that you might be surprised at, and others that, yeah, you might know a little bit about yourself. So as Kat said, I'm Ross Brannigan. I'll get a little bit more onto myself in a little bit. But first of all, I want to start us off with a bit of a story about a storyteller. So can you tell me who this is? Some of you might recognize him. Others, it'll be far, far, far too before your time for you to recognize him. But in the early days of television, so we're talking in the 1950s and 60s, this man started to bring the natural world into people's living rooms. And over the years, he traveled across the world, bringing more exotic creatures into people's lives, showing them countries that they maybe never had even heard of before. So really bringing to attention some of the issues that animals in landscapes that we'd never heard of before to people's attention, and making us care about them. Now, if you hadn't guessed who he was already, I am of course talking about Sir David Attenborough. So as the years went on, David Attenborough became one of the biggest names in nature documentaries, with Planet Earth, Blue Planet, and so many more documentaries telling us about the creatures that inhabit our world in exotic places, but also closer to home. Some of you might wonder what on earth this animal is and where this picture is taken from, but this is a capercaillie, which is in the Cairngorms in Scotland. So, as I say, it's not just exotic species that David Attenborough would bring to people's attention. He's showing us animals and wildlife closer to home, and we've got a whole world of wonders on our doorstep. And few people actually even realize it. So today, David Attenborough, I think he's now 97. He's getting on in years, but he's one of the biggest advocates for conservation, rewilding, and ending our use of fossil fuels. He is a hero to many people, not just my generation, but I imagine in yours as well. Across the spectrum, he really touches people's hearts and really captivates our imagination with the stories he tells. And he said, "We humans alone on Earth are powerful enough to create worlds and then to destroy them, to restore stability to our planet, and therefore we must restore its biodiversity. The very thing that we have removed is the only way out of this crisis that we ourselves have created. We must rewild the world." He's also said, "Young people, they care," and that's you guys. "They know that this world that they're growing up in is one that they will spend the rest of their lives in. But I think it's much more idealistic than that. They actually believe that humanity, the human species, has no right to destroy and despoil regardless." So David Attenborough probably the favorite storyteller for many people, but I imagine that you yourself have a favorite storyteller, and I want you to just have a little think about who is your favorite storyteller, and it could be anyone. We've got on the screen here, we've got George Monbiot on the left in the big picture, who's a really well-regarded writer, author of books, and a journalist, an environmental journalist. We've got Robert. I can't remember his name, the second name now. um, he's also an author, and yeah, takes people around the world with his stories. We've got Chris Packham down there, who I'm sure many of you recognise from Spring Watch and Autumn Watch. And then we've got Megan McCubbin, and down on the right hand side there, got Nan Shepherd, who's one of my favourite storytellers for the environment, and she was one of the first women to go out into the hills and talk about her adventures out there back in the 1950s. So just have a little think. It could be a TikTok creator, a presenter, a family member. Just have a think about who your favorite storyteller is and why. And it was Robert McFarlane is the name. But you're probably now wondering who I am. So Kat did a really lovely job of introducing me. But I'm Ross. I'm a journalist, a public speaker, a runner, and a cyclist. And as Kat said, I work for the conservation charity, the John Muir Trust, which is the photograph you can see of me doing my stuff on the right-hand side there. I've also been the editor of a student newspaper, so I was working as the editor-in-chief during that time. And very soon I'll be a features editor for a running magazine, which is very exciting. I've also worked on a bike race, which goes across Europe. So that photograph on the left of me working with my colleague Tom, recording a podcast, and of me chasing a cyclist in the middle there. That's me basically crossing Europe, following these cyclists on their adventures, going from Belgium to Bulgaria, or in next year's instance, from France to Turkey, which is very exciting. So I'm looking forward to that. In my spare time, like I say, I'm a runner. So I've ran across Majorca, the south coast of Turkey, the Jura Alps in France, and I'm also the author of Running Adventure Scotland. And you can see me and my dog signing books up there. But really, in large part, I am a storyteller. Stories are what drive me, and here I am. You can see telling people a little bit about the work of the John Muir Trust. So I'm telling them about a rare mountain tree that my work is planting on some mountains in the Lake District. You can see the little thing. It's not got any leaves on it because this photo was taken in autumn. But these trees are an extremely vulnerable habitat in the UK, and they provide really great habitats for invertebrates and for ground nesting birds. But unfortunately, it's a very depleted species in the UK. But my work, the John Muir Trust, we've planted over 2,000 of these trees on a local mountain to me in the Lake District, and we're now starting to see those trees actually spread naturally by themselves across the hillside. So I get to tell these kinds of stories to people and hopefully inspire them to support the John Muir Trust and to learn a little bit more about the landscapes that surround them. But I guess at the heart of it, really, and as you could probably tell, is for me a love of the outdoors and for nature. And that's just how you become a good storyteller. I could end this lesson here by telling you that being a good storyteller is about being passionate about the subject that you're interested in. It's about feeling that you want to tell other people the stories of the things that you care about, whether that's because you want to educate them or whether it's because you just want to inspire them and tell them about something you love. I mean, for me, I love writing about the outdoors, about wild landscapes, about nature, and how it makes me feel, because that's what I care about. I also love taking photographs of it, as you can see from that picture there. But if you are passionate about the environment, it's probably because you've experienced it yourself. Not many people care for a thing that they've never experienced before. And I think one of the things that we all have to remember is that there are people out there who unfortunately can't have the opportunity to experience wild places and really feel what being out in nature feels like. And I think that storytelling is a way to tell them why they should care about them. And ultimately, the more people that care about the outdoors and our natural environment, the better place it's going to be in for the future. So with that said, I want to just outline where we're going to go today. I'm not going to keep you here too long, but I do want to outline where we're going. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about why storytelling matters. I'm going to tell you how to become a storyteller, techniques of good storytellers, And then if we have any questions at the end, I can take some. So to start off, part one, if you like, why does storytelling matter? Now, I studied journalism at university, and one of the things we got drilled into us from day one is that journalism is the fourth estate. Now, that sounds a little bit grandiose, but the fourth estate is in relation to politics. The other three estates being the church, the nobility, and the people. And so, for fundamentally, journalism is about holding those in power to account. And journalists are part of that. So you can see Andrew Marr there interviewing Michael Gove on the top right, holding him to account for the things that go on in government, and him who's charged with looking after our country and who's charged with doing the best he can across the world for the United Kingdom. Ultimately, journalists are there to hold them to account to make sure that they are doing that. Now, this might be a little bit strange. Why use an image of a duck pond on this slide? And for those of you who are slightly older in the audience, you might be aware of this story that broke, and I'm sorry to say this, back in 2009. So if you remember this story, then that might be a bit of a shock for you. But this image is related to a story that came out in 2009. And it turned out that members of parliament in the UK were using taxpayers' money to fund personal things like paying for duck ponds in their garden. But the Daily Telegraph caught wind of this, and the story basically exploded. It was all over the news at the time, and it resulted in 8 MPs being charged and reforms in how MPs can claim money. It was a massive story at the time, and it just goes to show a great example how storytelling can be about accountability. And when we're thinking about the environment, I mean, this is a really good example. We've made a lot of pledges on reducing carbon emissions, about reducing our reliance on fossil fuels. We're seeing changing weather patterns, species dying out, the world is warming, and yet we're seeing more oil fields being put into the North Sea. So one of the ways that you, as a storyteller, can work to protect the environment is by holding governments to account on the promises that they've made. Some things need to change, and we need good storytellers to hold governments to account, and so that they follow through on promises and that they protect our environment for future generations. So the second thing that I want to talk about why storytelling is important is about empathy. Some of you probably know what empathy means, but empathy is understanding someone's feelings. And stories can help us understand people's feelings even when they're far, far away from us. I don't think many of you have probably been to Iraq before. Some of you have probably heard it on the news, I imagine, about war and terrorism. But Iraq is full of people just like you and me who are trying to make a life and who have cares and responsibilities just like us. And the reason I bring this to your attention is because I read a book recently called Wounded Tigress, where a man, Leon McCarran, goes down a boat in the River Tigris in Iraq. And he speaks to people who live by the river and see what's happened to the river over the years. And the photo of the man at the start, this guy who's sitting on the rock here, his home is currently being submerged by water because a dam, which has been built, is now actually starting to submerge his home. The dam has blocked the river's path, the river's starting to swell, and ultimately the village will disappear in a few days' time. And yes, that dam is to create electricity, which ultimately is a renewable energy source, but these people have been forcibly removed from their homes. And so listening to that story, reading that story from Leon, I started to understand a little bit more about the nuances of what happens in this country. And similarly, as they went down the river, they found more and more examples of how the river was being degraded. They were seeing litter and waste choking the riverside. It was releasing toxins into the water, which is ultimately harming the fish that people eat. And it's also causing problems for people being able to find clean drinking water, something that you and I take for granted every day. So even basic things like clean water is becoming hard to find. And that is really why storytelling is important. Storytelling can take us to places, take people who we're speaking to different places they've never been to, never maybe even heard of, just like David Attenborough, and tell you stories about people and places, just like your home, just like your friends, and make us want to care about them. Because ultimately, we're all citizens of the same planet. We're all on this planet together, and it's very easy to go by living in a bubble and thinking that these things won't affect you, but they do affect us, and they affect hundreds of thousands of people across the planet. And we have to remember that the only way that we find out about these things is through stories. So, a little bit of a quiz for you. Can you guess which one of these photographs was taken in the UK? I'll give you 2 seconds. So if you guess the one on the right, you're wrong. But if you guess the one on the left, then you are correct. So that photograph is taken from Glen Feshie, which is up in the Cairngorms, where the Capercaillie photograph was taken that I showed you earlier. And it's one of the biggest rewilding projects in the UK. In the Cairngorms, the environmentalists there are controlling herbivore numbers to allow the trees to bounce back and allowing the ecosystem to restore into balance. But why am I telling you this? Well, storytelling can also be inspiring. So, storytelling is about giving people stories about amazing things that people are doing or amazing things, amazing places around the world, and making us feel inspired to maybe do something ourselves, to do something similar, to push governments to do something similar, to tell stories about things in your area that you think are quite inspiring and that could inspire others to do something similar. Because ultimately, change is actually possible. Inspiring people can make change, and change is how we see change in how we do things, change in how we see things, changes in our relationships with nature. And I really do think that inspiring people through storytelling can mean that change can happen. And lastly, just to come back to this image, storytelling is knowledge. It's passing on information to people. You're telling a story, you're giving them information perhaps they never knew before, and you're educating them, telling them why things matter. Like I was saying earlier, these people didn't know anything about the mountain trees that I was telling them about. They didn't know that it was a really essential habitat and that actually it was close to extinction in the Lake District. So when I talk to people about the environment, I'm giving them possibly new information that helps them see the world differently or maybe makes them understand it better. They can tell someone else, and then you know it, more people are educated in what protecting the environment is all about. So ultimately, knowledge is power, and I know that's a little bit cliche, but people can then hold governments to account, empathize with people, and bring about change if they have more knowledge. So that's the end of part one. So now you know why storytelling matters. I'm now going to tell you a little bit more about how to become a storyteller. And this image, for context, is me, as I said earlier on, chasing a cyclist, interviewing them halfway through the transcontinental bike race. And you might not be able to tell from this photograph, but we're actually going downhill. So runner versus cyclist going downhill is only really going to end up one way. And I felt very, very exhausted after trying to interview the woman on the bike there. um, so how to become a storyteller? Well, it goes kind of without saying that to tell a story, you need a story. Every storyteller needs a story. Stories can be found from so many different places, but very often you get them from people. Speaking to people helps you find a story. This photograph, for instance, this chap Josh, he just spent about 5 hours riding in circles trying to find the place he was meant to go for the night. And he's just telling me about the ordeal he's gone through and how many hills he's had to climb. And it's just an interesting story that adds a human touch to what I was trying to write about. But, it can be quite nerve-wracking to ask a stranger about a story, but you don't need to do that. You just need to listen. Because what in listening you'll find is that you find your nose for news. So this is another thing I was drilled into at university. But bear in mind, no new skill is learned overnight because once you start doing something, you always have to practice it. And one of those things is about finding your nose for news. In other words, stories, I guess. Um, so, finding a nose for news comes with practice. That comes from listening to people. It comes from understanding what would be a good story. When I was at university, that got drilled into me, and it ended up meaning that I wrote over 100 articles for the newspaper and ultimately becoming its editor. So surround yourself with diverse friends. Keep your ear and eyes out for interesting stories, and just don't be afraid to ask questions. There's absolutely nothing wrong with being a storyteller, especially when you've got good intentions. If you're writing for the environment and you hear someone is doing something interesting, you think, that's a great story. I would love to write about that. I would love to interview that person. I'd love to get them on a podcast because in the end, you want to give people information that adheres to the four pillars I talked about earlier, which is accountability, empathy, inspiration, and knowledge. And I've got a little example that's not quite related to the environment, but I think it's a good one nonetheless. Um, so I was reading a book about running, and I just so happened to notice this photograph. And in the description, it listed a man called Pete Barron was in this picture. And the photograph is taken from a very famous record-breaking attempt back in the 1980s. And when I saw that photograph and I saw the writing underneath it, I went, I know that man. I work with him. And I didn't realize how big a name Pete was in the running scene when I started working with him. And I'd known him for a long time. I knew he was a good runner, but I didn't know that he was particularly involved in something quite as big as this. So I decided to dig a little deeper, and it turned out that my colleague actually did this quite a lot back in the 1980s and 1990s. So what I decided to do was I got my nose for news out. I thought, that's a good story. He was always fast. He was always involved in these kind of big races, but he was never quite fast enough to win. And so I felt it was worth the story. So I wrote a piece about it for a local magazine, and I talked about his life, his work, and how he went from being a top runner to now being working in conservation in the Lake District. You just never really know when a story might come along, and you just have to be ready to pick it up when it does. And that is about using your nose for news. I mean, I like, when it comes to telling your story, so now you've kind of figured out, how to find a story. What about telling your story? So for me, I am a writer, and writing does give you lots of different options. So you've got books, you've got magazines, you've got newspapers, the whole shebang. But you might be someone who really loves podcasts, or you love videos and films. You like think about presenting the news, or you want to present a documentary, or you are a photographer and you want to tell stories through photography. So there's never one way to tell a story, and I would actually recommend, you guys are young, get out there and just try everything. Don't feel like you have to put yourself into I'm a writer or I'm a photographer. There is no harm in trying everything. I know I have. I've experimented with filmmaking, I've tried podcasting, I know I'm good at writing, so I've stuck with that, but it's not to say that I might not try something in the future. But what I would say is that just create, create, create. Whatever you decide to do, whatever you decide to tell, just practice it. Um, I mean, I've maintained a blog myself for a few years, and it just so happened that one day I got a phone call from somebody who offered me to write a book. Um, and it's just what happens. You never know who's going to be out there reading the stuff that you create. And it might feel sometimes like no one's actually reading your stuff or no one's listening to what you've got to say, but they probably are. So I would just say, chip away at it, keep working. And maybe in the end, you'll find yourself, like I am in this photograph, running around on a hillside, figuring out where to go because I've got a book to write. And that's quite exciting. So I'd now like to talk a little bit about the techniques of good storytelling, and I think that kind of goes into a few different avenues. So the first one, and probably the most important, is to think about your audience. Who are you writing this for? Who are you making this podcast for? Who are you making this film for? Really think about who your audience is, because that way you'll know how to present your information to them. So for newspapers, for instance, if you think about how a newspaper is structured, the very most important information is right at the top of the article. It wants to grab your attention as quickly as it can, because most people reading a newspaper only read a third of what your article has to say. And that can be a little bit soul crushing because you put loads of effort into writing this amazing story about someone who's doing an amazing environmental project in your area. But if it's news, people are probably going to read the first few paragraphs and then they're going to move on. So what you need is speed. Okay. For magazine articles, they can be a little bit longer. So I'm talking about feature articles, something more immersive. They want more of a story. They want more inspiration. It's less bang, bang, bang like a newspaper article. You just want to give people that kind of inspiring story that like takes them on a journey with you. The other thing to think about is things like, think about your language that you're using as well. I mean, this won't be too much of a problem for too many of you just now, but if you think about it in the future, if you are writing for, say, a science magazine or something, you'll probably be able to use quite scientific language whenever you're writing for your audience. But if you're writing for a more general audience, then you have to think about the language you use. You need to make it accessible. Use language people will understand and that's clear and is clarity so that you can get your point across really easily. And that comes with practice and comes with a little bit of just keeping your audience in mind. Um, so one of the things that I think is really, really important, and not many people realize it, that even that they're doing it or that it's a thing, is the principle of show, don't tell. So if we compare these two sentences, I walked on the frosty grass on a cold morning. Okay, cool. Like you're walking, it's cold. Right, got it. Or frozen grass crunched beneath my feet as my breath rose in whirls of steam. See how I managed to tell that it was still cold? It's probably still morning. I'm still going over grass, but I'm actually using much more sense-based language. I'm using things like sounds. I'm using like what my breath was doing. I'm more involved in the story. And I would give the challenge to you. Imagine you try to describe a cold morning or describe that someone looks tired or that they look happy or that they look, you know, stressed without saying they look tired, happy, stressed. Because if you think about it, what does tired look like? No one's got written on their head tired. So you can't see that someone is tired. You have to see that they maybe have bags under their eyes. Maybe they're a bit pale. Maybe they're looking a bit drawn. Think about the things you're seeing and think about how they sound and how they even taste or what you felt. All of these things go into making a really engaging story that puts people into your story. It creates a lasting impression and they're really engaged in what you're saying. So a little bit of a task for you if you like. So you give this a go. Try to describe the day outside your classroom or the surroundings of your school or the landscape around you, whatever you want, and try to paint a picture of it. Try and think about how you experienced it. Think about what you felt, what you saw, what you smelt, what you heard, and even what you tasted. So just try to really put yourself into a place and really think about your experience. It's quite a fun exercise to do, and it is quite hard, and it will take practice, but honestly, it will make your storytelling a million times better than just being really bland and saying it was cold, because that doesn't engage anybody. Um, a really easy way to engage people in your storytelling is to speak to other people. And that can mean interviews, it can mean using people as sources of information, but people add depth, meaning, and a human touch to your story. Think about the kind of angles you're going at. So someone who you're interviewing might give you an angle, which is to say a different look at your story that you never even thought of. You're going down this path of, say, there's a new wind turbine is being put up in an area near somebody's home, and the story is great news, renewable power, etc., etc. And then you decide to speak to the locals, and they say, actually, it's going to really damage the ground that we live on. There are going to be bulldozers coming through. It's going to ruin the landscape. So there's a potential there for you to find a story that's way more interesting than your original one that you thought of. And you will get a lot from interviewing people, but I know that's kind of tricky and nerve-wracking, and you want to just do it over email or text or whatever. I'll be honest with you, there's no easy way of getting round to interviewing people. Talking on the phone is always better, and meeting face to face is even better than that. Try interviewing people that you know first. That really helps, and really focus on your kind of like why, where, what, when, and how questions. Lead your questions with those words. Why do you feel this way about this wind turbine? How will it affect your life? When did you hear about it for the first time? Think about those type of questions because it will mean people will fill your questions with answers and you'll get a far more well-rounded story than you previously thought. And I guess the last thing I would say in terms of how to become a good storyteller is read, watch, and listen widely. The best writers in the world didn't get anywhere by just writing, they had to read a lot. The best podcasters don't get anywhere by just doing a podcast themselves. you have to keep your eyes open for inspiration and hear what other people are saying. So just think about the information you absorb and try to get good quality sources of information. I've left some at the end that I think are a good starting point for people. Um, but yeah, I would say find good quality sources of stories and try to take some inspiration from them, because I find that the more you sample these types of stories, that the better you ultimately will get at writing and telling your own. Um, and I guess to finish off with, storytelling's a bit like cooking. So if you think about it, each sentence is an ingredient. Every interview is like a spice. And to get better at cooking, you have to try other dishes. You have to keep trying. But good food, just like good stories, take time. And good stories, just like good food, are not always liked by everybody. But even the best chefs in the world aren't liked by everyone. And I don't see why that is a good reason for them to stop. So if anyone is critical of your storytelling, just remember that even the best chefs in the world aren't liked by everyone. So keep doing it, keep going, keep telling stories, because they're important and they matter. And that kind of brings me back full circle. David Attenborough, he's one of the greatest environmental storytellers of a time and of our time, and he's a massive source of inspiration for me. Um, but he kind of won't be here forever, I'm afraid. He is 97. He's done another documentary series. I'd love to see David Attenborough live forever and ever and ever, but ultimately he won't be here forever. And we need new storytellers. We need people like you to inspire and educate others. And we need new people to hold governments to account so that we can live in a more sustainable world. And we need basically more storytellers just like you to tell them. So all I would say now is go find a story. I finish on this photograph because I just kind of find it quite funny. And I think a photograph, as they say, tells 1,000 words. And maybe this photograph has a story in itself. I don't know. But thank you very much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you found this useful. Try the activities that I've mentioned and go find a story. I'll now take some time for questions.
Thank you, Ross. That was amazing. The resources that you mentioned we'll put up on our website so that everyone can find them.
Yep.
Um, I've got a couple questions for you if you like,
Oh, yeah, sure. Go
if
on.
that's okay. I've got two. Is that okay?
Yes, that's perfect.
Okay. So the first one is, and I think this is a good one because the themes for young reporters, as you know, are biodiversity loss, climate change, and environmental pollution.
Mhm.
None of which are very well. There's quite a bit of negative news about all of these issues in the
Mm,
press just now. So our question is, if people are getting tired of hearing about it, or maybe anxious of hearing, news about environmental issues, particularly with regard to climate change, um,
yeah.
how can we write about it, or how can we talk about it so that it doesn't sound like more of the same negative news or make the anxiety problem worse?
Yeah. So I think that's a really interesting one. And I guess I'd point towards some studies which were done actually about litter. And when I was working for Keep Scotland Beautiful, I found this one out. Um, so researchers found that the more photographs that you share of overflowing bins and rubbish at the side of the road, the more people will see that as the norm, and they'll keep
Hmm.
throwing rubbish on the road, and they'll keep, you know, stacking bins up or chucking litter out of their pocket. Whereas the more that we showed photographs of clean places, the more people felt that that was normal.
Hmm.
So what I would say is that yes, there is a lot of bad news at the moment about the climate crisis, and I'm not immune to the anxiety that comes with it as well. But
Hmm.
what I would say is that there are actually good stories out there. I think there are far more people than we think who are looking after nature, about wanting to do something local in their community. I think those people are out there, and there are people doing really cool stuff. And I think we just have to tell their stories.
Hmm.
The impact of the climate crisis and biodiversity loss is, we have to keep those stories going out, because ultimately we have to show that our governments are just not doing enough quick enough. But I do think there are plenty of stories out there of people doing really great things, um, that will inspire other people and hopefully bring about change, because ultimately that like pushing through change has to come from somewhere, and it can't just be from sitting on the couch and watching TV and feeling how terrible the world is.
Hmm.
It comes from getting out there and doing stuff and interacting with people. So if people are able to, I would say honestly, go and volunteer at a local sort of environmental or like wildlife sanctuary or whatever is close to you. There's plenty of them out there, the Wildlife Trust and so on, who are doing great stuff. John Muir Trust, if you happen to be close to one of their sites, go volunteer, go speak to people who are going to them and ask them, why are you here? Why have you been motivated to come to this event?
Hmm.
Why do you want to volunteer? And speak to the people running the event, and hey presto, you've got yourself a good story.
Hmm.
Um, Go and find them. They won't come along while you're sat in your bedroom watching TikTok or doing playing video games. I know the new Call of Duty's just come out, so there's no point in just sitting in your room doing those things. Get out and experience the world, and you will find positive stories.
Yeah, we have a network of groups through Keep Scotland Beautiful that young people can also approach. There should be one in just about near just about every town and village in the country. So
Mm.
um, they're called It's Your Neighbourhood and Beautiful Scotland, the two campaigns that we run there. And we also have a network of litter picking groups that get in touch with us about the work that they do. I know they're always looking for young volunteers, and I know that they would really appreciate a young
Yeah.
person coming out to tell their story as well.
Yeah,
So that's a good shout, Ross. Yeah.
absolutely, absolutely. I mean, like working for a conservation charity myself, and I know how many times I've gone to a volunteering event, and it's usually people who are maybe retired, who come along to those events. And honestly, as someone who works for a conservation charity, we are crying out for more young people to be involved. Get out and do stuff. Come
That's
and
right.
see these things. Go volunteer.
Yep.
Honestly, you'll love it, and you'll feel like you're doing the right thing.
And it can feel a bit intimidating to take that first step. But
Yeah.
there are a lot of folk out there with a lot of knowledge and a lot of experience, and they would love to pass it on to someone who is looking to
Mm,
learn about what they're doing.
definitely.
So young people are very, very welcome in these groups, even though it might be a bit intimidating to take that first step and try it out.
Yep.
Okay, so here's question number two for you. You talked about writing for your student newspaper and how now you're a published author and features editor, and you've come a long way since your
Mm-hmm.
student days.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just wondering, where would you suggest a young person starts in high school just now? If they're not in university yet, they don't have like a student union or a student newspaper to work for, where would you suggest is the best place they can get started?
Yeah, so I think a lot of it just comes off of your own back. You have to be quite industrious.
Mm-hmm.
I think these things don't come without some effort. And when I was even in school, I think I started up a blog about politics. It was called RBNC News, Ross Brannigan News and Comment, I think. And honestly, I wrote so many articles about politics and news and stuff like that. And just doing that meant that like people started to notice that I was kind of writing stuff. Not
Mm-hmm.
necessarily, I wasn't writing, golden poetry or beautiful prose and stuff. It was just me having thoughts, but it just showed I had initiative.
Mm-hmm.
And I think actually the fact that you can display that you have some initiative and that you're a bit motivated to do things in your own time,
Mm-hmm.
that's really all people look for, and people will notice that ultimately. And whether you then decide, if you don't decide to go to university and you're really interested in doing, I don't know, say you want to go into journalism, go speak to your local newspaper. I mean,
Absolutely.
mine was the Alloa Advertiser, and
Mm-hmm.
I threw a couple of story ideas their way. And I got a couple of articles in, and then they asked me to go and do something else, and then I ended up like seeing. I think I spoke to a university professor at one point, and he was like, "Oh, you've written for the Advertiser, or you've done this, you've got a blog. Do you want to go and work for the BBC an election?" And I was like, that
Yes,
sounds
please.
amazing. And then that was in 2014, and I ended up being involved in the independence referendum, in the next general election, Scottish government elections, the European referendum, and all of these, I just went to a voting house. I worked for the BBC as a freelancer. I gathered stories and this, that, and the next thing. It's just being open and seeing an opportunity, going, I have to do that or I have to do that. No one's going to come along and offer you on a silver platter that often. You have to go out and get it. So I'd say, first off, just start writing about things or start creating things that you're interested in. It can be weird, wonderful, I don't care. Just start making stuff. Someone's going to notice.
Absolutely.
And then when you go to a job and you or a newspaper or the BBC and you say, "Hey, I want a job or I want this apprenticeship," and they'll go, "Great. Show us an example of the time when you wrote a story or you've gathered evidence or you've done this." And you go, "I've actually done loads of that through school and nobody told me to do it. I just did it." And they'd be like, "That person shows initiative. They're motivated. They know how to find a story. They've learned some skills like how to use WordPress or Squarespace or whatever. You know how to edit a video together. You know how to edit music together." I mean, I made videos during high school that were just a load of nonsense, but I learned how to use like iMovie and
Sure.
things. And then now in my job now, I get asked to do some video stuff, or in previous jobs, I've used Photoshop and things just because I learned it as I went. And so
Yeah.
just, I'm afraid there's no easy way to get it, and no one's going to come to you with something ready made. You just have to go chase it.
Well,
And
maybe
then
Young
then
Reporters
they
is a
come
little bit
along.
of that. It's a little bit ready-made. We're all
Yeah.
hoping that by participating in Young Reporters, you do learn some of those skills, and
Mm,
it is an international audience. So
yeah.
we are
I mean,
hoping that young
young,
people will be able to reach an international audience and spread their voice
definitely.
further.
Yeah. I mean, young reporters, yeah, it comes ready made. It still requires you to put some effort in to get a
It
good
does.
story together. And I think the more that you can, the better, the more dividends come out of it. I mean, I can now say I'm an award-winning writer thanks to the Young Reporters for the Environment. Like,
You can.
you can
That's
sort
what I
of,
did fail to mention at the beginning is that young Ross has been one of our previous award-winning young reporters. And now look at him.
here I
So,
am.
yep. Well, thank you so much, Ross, for your lesson and for answering our questions.
Not at all.
You mentioned some skills, and I would say that leads
Yeah.
us nicely into our next sessions, which will be reaching out to the media with our communications manager at Keep Scotland Beautiful, Suzanne Roberts. So she will be talking to us about how to write for media, how to write for newspapers, basically, how to get your story published in the media, what they're looking for, because it's a slightly different way of writing for media as it is for writing for different for writing for your own novel or writing an essay, for example. There's some tips that she has. And also, as Ross was saying, conducting a good interview is another skill. And I will be hosting a session in the new year, all about interview skills, what questions you can ask, who to reach out to, what makes a good source of information, and how to get the most out of your time when you're interviewing someone. But Ross, I want to thank you again for your time today. I know you're extremely busy, and so I appreciate you taking the time out of your day job and your writing to be with us today, and to share your knowledge and experience as a journalist and a reporter, and someone who has experience of our Young Reporters program as well.
No,
Um,
thank you.
Thank you very much. I hope that our audience today can join us for some of our other sessions. And like I said, the resources that you recommended in your presentation, I will link to on our website on the Young Reporters part of our page, so that if you're watching this and recording and you would like to read further, you can have a look there. But that is all we have time for today. So I'll say thank you again and bye for now.